Whenever you're working with masks, sooner or later you're going to accidentally end up creating some shapes instead. But instead of just getting all frustrated and annoyed that your mask didn't work, shapes and shape layers actually give you a really easy way to add some cool visual elements to your compositions for your motion graphics or visual effects without having to use any images. So let's jump into Adobe After Effects and look at how we can create and what we can do with shape layers. Back in Adobe After Effects, and hopefully you remember this effect of the 3 thieving clones that we created in the last lesson. We did touch very briefly on how to create shape layers, but more in the context of how to avoid creating shape layers when you're trying to create a mask. Now in this video I want to talk about how to deliberately create shape layers and all of the cool stuff that you can actually do with them. Remember, in order to create shapes in Adobe After Effects, you use the exact same tools you use for masking. So up in the toolbar, you have the rectangle tool. And again, if you click and hold, you've got rectangles, rounded rectangles, ellipses, polygons, and stars. And obviously you have the pen tool where you can draw free form shapes in any way that you want. So let's for now go over to the left-hand side and select the rounded rectangle tool. And if you don't have any of your layers selected, so make sure you have no layers selected, just click somewhere to unselect everything. And you now click and drag in your preview window. You're going to create a shape. So this actually just creates a shape. And down in my layers panel, I can see a new shape layer created over here on the right hand side, which if I collapse it, is separate from my 3 video layers. And if you expand this layer, you can actually see in its contents, it has a rectangle. And that's this rectangle shape that we just created. Now, you may have noticed that when you selected either the shape tool or the pen tool, kind of in the middle top of the interface, you'll have these new options appear. These are options for defining how that shape looks. With our new shape still selected, so under the shape layer, contents, we've got rectangle 1 selected. At the top, we can change the fill and the stroke of this shape. So let's click on this fill color selector. Maybe we'll change this to a muted green. And the stroke is white right now, so let's click on that. Maybe we'll make this like a light blue, and it's probably way too small to even see. So on the right hand side, let's just bring up this pixel so we can increase the thickness of that stroke outline. So we now have a slightly fancier shape. Now you can add many shapes into the same shape layer. In order to do that, simply make sure that your shape layer is selected and then grab a pen tool, or maybe we're going to go with a star tool for now, and then simply click and drag to create your new shape. The cool thing about the star tool is while you still drag to create it, you can scroll your mouse wheel up or down to add or remove points from this shape. You can also hold down Control or Command on the Mac and drag with your mouse to define how spiky that star will be. Once you let go, you've placed your new star, and in our shape layer, we now have a rectangle and a polystar. Again, let's select the polystar. Let's just change the fill. Maybe we'll make this one a little bit more orange, maybe just a bit warmer as well. Let's change the outline color. Maybe I want this one to be slightly red and maybe not quite as thick. And again, press V to return to the selection tool. And you can now click and drag these shapes around at will. And you will notice that the options for the fill, stroke, and other effects change depending on which shape you have selected. So obviously you can modify them individually. Let's collapse this shape layer. If you don't have this shape layer selected, so let's unselect everything and let's maybe grab the pen tool and let's draw a new shape. Adobe After Effects will create a new shape layer because it didn't know that you wanted to add the shape to an existing one. So delete this layer, make sure the shape layer 1 is selected. And now if you create a new shape, that one will again be added to the shape layer. If you expand it, under Contents, you will now find a rectangle, a polystar, and a shape. Let's delete the polystar, so just select it and press delete. Select the shape and delete that as well. Press V to return to the selection tool. I'm just going to drag this shape back into the middle. And what I might do as well, let's collapse this. Let's delete the thieving clone layers. I think they're more distracting than anything. And let's create a pretty trippy 2D shape animation effect. For that, the first thing I'm going to do is let's create a new solid layer. Just a little bit of a soft gradient in the background of this effect. So right click into your layer window, come to new, and let's create a new solid. I'm going to call this one gradient and hit OK. Make sure that this gradient obviously sits below your shape layer. Come into the effects and presets panel over on the right hand side. And let's search for the gradient ramp effect. Let's apply this effect to the gradient layer. And yeah, that doesn't look too bad. I'm not too keen on the color. Let's just change the end color maybe to a very, very dark blue. I just want a very little bit of a gradient. And remember, whenever you do work with gradients, come into your project panel and make sure you're setting your project to 32 bits per channel. Simply by holding down Alt or Option and clicking on this icon to turn this to 32 bits per channel, the gradients will just look a little bit nicer. I'm not 100% sure how well those gradients come through in the video itself, but it just looks a lot nicer on my screen. Now let's select the shape layer, expand it, make sure the rectangle is selected, and you can check whether that's selected by changing some of these properties, and we definitely have the rectangle selected. And now let's add some animation. Down in your layer window, let me just make this a little bit bigger again, you can expand the shape, like the rectangle that we've created, and in here you'll find all sorts of different properties that if you expand them, like the stroke, the fill, the path itself, and you can keyframe all of these properties to, have this appear or change color, all sorts of other cool things. But I'm going to leave these ones collapsed for now, reselect the rectangle one, and instead I'm going to use a much easier way to add effects and all sorts of other cool things to this shape. At the top, with your rectangle shape selected, you'll find this little pop-out add icon. In this menu, you will find options to, for example, create a shape group, and we haven't touched on that yet. It essentially allows you to add multiple shapes into a group and apply effects to the entire group. You can obviously apply more shapes like rectangles, ellipses, polystars, path, etc. You can create fills, strokes, or very cool gradient fills and gradient strokes. Or you can apply all sorts of cool effects. One thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a gradient fill. So this now has added a gradient fill effect to the rectangle itself, and you can kind of adjust this in any way you want. So let's just move this about a little bit. Down in the layer window, let's pop open the gradient fill, and under colors, you can actually edit the gradient colors. So you can really create some really funky gradients with, many, many different colors. You can have like a bit of a rainbow effect. Just kind of click and create a few colors to make this look a little bit more trippy. So, and then push these about. You can see how the gradient looks right there. And maybe I'll just drag the start and end point of this gradient. So that looks kind of cool. So we now added a gradient fill to our rectangle. Let's come back up into add, and maybe we'll add a pucker and bloat. Down in your shape layer, under the rectangle shape, you now have a pucker and bloat option. Let's expand this out, and you can now bring up or down this amount to kind of create some really cool, interesting shapes if you wanted to, or you can animate this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come to the beginning of my composition, and just for fun, let's animate this. Let's say this starts out at 0. Let's enable the stopwatch icon, move forward to maybe about 2 seconds, and let's bring this up to, maybe we'll go with about 65. Come back to 6 seconds. Let's change this to minus 65. Come to 10 seconds. And we can bring this back up to 65, or I can just simply select, I know that this keyframe is 65, this one is minus 65. Let's select these two keyframes and copy them with Ctrl or Command and C, then paste them into the current timeline indicator with Ctrl or Command and V. And let's go to 18 seconds and just paste them in. And again, let's select all of the keyframes, press F9 to enable Bezier interpolation. And now if you play this back, you have this really cool animating shape layer. Kind of mesmerizing. Now, there is a huge amount to shape layers and cool stuff you can do with them, and I encourage you to just experiment and try everything out. There's so much cool stuff you can do. The last thing I want to show you, though, is the repeater effect. So let's reselect our shape. Up at the top, under Add, let's open this up, and let's add a repeater effect. The repeater effect essentially allows you to repeat and animate and scale and rotate all of those copies like a trail of shapes coming from a single shape on your layer. For that, in the layer window, let's open up the repeater effect that we've just added, and you can define how many copies you want to add. Let's say I want to add 6 copies. You can also offset these shapes to animate them kind of moving about the screen, kind of like a snake's or caterpillar style effect. Let's make sure I reset this offset to 0, and let's bring up the transform options for the repeater. This defines the changes that are applied to each new copy of this shape. Right now, the only property that has a value is the position, which defines 100 pixels in the X direction, which is why every new copy of our shape is moved 100 pixels over to the right. If I now bring down this scale, for example, let's move this a little bit smaller, what happens is that every copy of our shape is 83% of its origin. So it's getting smaller and smaller towards the tail end. So you can kind of create some really funky effects. You can also rotate it. So every copy is rotated around. Obviously, you can animate this to kind of create some really, really interesting and organic looking effect. You can define the opacity, so you can fade out the tail if you wanted to. So it kind of gets more transparent to the end or at the beginning. You can also change the anchor point if you wanted to. There's all sorts of cool things that you can do. And again, you can obviously animate these in any way that you want. Now, the last thing, let's select our shape. Let's come up into add and let's add one more effect. Let's add a twist effect. Let's open up the twist effect and let's bring up this angle to really kind of twist our entire shape with all of its copies. So we're creating this really cool swirly effect. And the cool thing is, have a look what happens now. It's because our shape still changes, right? We've animated the pucker and bloat effect. So that gets rippled through all of the copies and all of the effects on this shape. And you can create some really trippy stuff. Just for fun, let's animate the angle of this twist effect as well. Let's enable keyframes. And let's start at 0. Let's say at about 4. I want to have an angle of maybe about 200 or something. Let's go maybe to 8 seconds. Maybe I want that to be back at 0. Then go back a little bit. And maybe I want to twist the other way. Couple of hundreds. And again, let's just select them all. Press F9 to enable Bezier interpolation. And now if you rewind and play this back, you have a really cool, organic looking, trippy animation created with absolutely nothing but shape layers. While shape layers may seem simple on the surface, there's so much you can do with them. You can color them in, you can reshape them, you can twist them, you can animate them, you can repeat them. They're really great for creating some really interesting motion graphics. So dig into them, experiment, and just have some fun.